Let me begin by saying that while my views differ from Mr. Molyneux's on the topic postulated in his video, I bear no personal animus toward Mr. Molyneux. In fact, I admire his rational, mono or dialectical approach to rational debate. My rebuttal is focused on merely the postulated arguments and is in no way personal or ad hominem in nature. With that said, let's begin the rebuttal. It should be noted that Mr. Molyneux does not change his mind about whether climate change exists. He does not deny that climate change is extant and is a real phenomenon. Indeed, he goes so far as to provide some possible technical solutions or remedies, salting the atmosphere, for example. Rather, he contends that scientists are people, people are corruptible, and therefore some scientists are corrupt. Because some scientists deal with climate science, therefore some climate science must be corrupt. The source of that corruption, whether for monetary gain, power, glory, or influence of an individual or group, is not of prime importance here, but rather that such corruption is not taken into consideration as part of the common narrative, and as such presents climate change adherents, in this case the government in general, with a distorted perspective which they are unwilling or unable to admit to. I refute this argument by Mr. Molyneux, and I refute it based on the following premises. First, Mr. Molyneux makes an unsupported contention or logical leap that because people can be corrupted, entire fields of human endeavor are therefore corrupted. This is false. Second, Mr. Molyneux makes an incorrect judgment of what science is. Scientists are not magical elves or priests. They are merely people who observe and record their observations. Science is a self-correcting discipline. It invites error so that it can discover what is not an error. It invites skepticism. Indeed, it is founded entirely on skepticism. Think of medieval scientist skepticism of heliocentrism as just one example, and Copernicus paid the price for that. Scientists were skeptical of other 19th century biologists' claims that some animals could go extinct, that fossils represented life on Earth from hundreds of thousands or even millions of years in the past. And many current cosmologists are skeptical of the theory of multiple universes or dimensions. Einstein was famously skeptical of much of quantum physics. Skepticism is the foundational spirit of science. So ultimately, because science is self-correcting, it is mutable. Because it is mutable, there is no dogma, just a currently accepted consensus, but no dogma. And finally, anyone can be a scientist. So by these arguments, as I elaborate on later, science is the least corruptible of human disciplines and is not subject to the corruption of entire fields of study, as Mr. Molyneux by conjecture alludes to. Third, and most damningly, Mr. Molyneux does not address the science and body of data pertaining to climate change. Mr. Molyneux hasn't changed his mind about people, who he already acknowledged to be corruptible, and he hasn't refuted any particular data, such as the rate of warming or the acidification of oceans. The only thing he seems to have changed his mind about is the political motivations of government-funded research, which is a question of politics, not of science. And since the views espoused are framed via a libertarian bent, which frames most of Mr. Molyneux's videos, and which I do not judge but merely point out as an observation, then indeed nothing new has been stated, and his mind was therefore not changed about anything. It was, all in all, a waste of time for everybody. But let's talk about corruption in more detail. We should make a distinction between the corruptibility of individuals and the corruptibility of entire fields of study. Indeed, I postulate that science is a unique human enterprise and that the scientific method of inquiry, unlike any other human activity I'm aware of, is self-correcting, skeptical of itself, and holds to no single truth or dogma. Data, the foundation of scientific claim, is entirely based on empirical observation of the world around us, which we can measure with our own human senses, or by instruments which can see beyond our senses. There is no truth in science, just what we know today. The media may often portray science as headlines of stark truth. But there is no absolute truth in science, just our best understanding of the data collected to date. One of my most memorable experiences as a biology undergraduate was of my cellular biology professor on the first day of class holding up the large 1,000-page tome or textbook called appropriately The Cell before the class and saying simply, "Nothing in this book is true. It is merely what we know about cells today." Scientific consensus is like reading the journal entries of 1,000 people living in Boston and trying to get a sense for what it's like to ride the subway in downtown. Eventually a consensus emerges, which is often a blend of many people's observations over time and is always open to reinterpretation and new data points. As such, I render a new postulate, that science is less subject to corruption than stock brokerage, because the long-run risks of corruption outweigh the long-run gains in science. Policy and politics aside, science may only be corrupted if the data supporting a conclusion is corrupted or doctored. This has undoubtedly happened and does happen from time to time in any scientific field, be it stem cells, cancer research, cold fusion, geochemistry, etc. The reason such claims hold no long-term benefit for the corrupter is that scientific inquiry is like open source computer programming. Anyone else can look at it and other people will immediately seek to repeat the experiment. If the experiment cannot be repeated under the same conditions, it will quickly be debunked or cast aside as a fluke, frivolous, or contaminated in some way. Corrupt manipulation of data holds no long-term benefit. On the contrary, the corrupter runs the very serious risk of loss of influence and prestige, not because their assertions are different, but because they were discredited as fabrications. A recent example is the Korean scientist Hwang Woo-suk, who was charged with embezzlement and bioethics law violations in 2007 after it emerged much of his stem cell research had been faked. Conversely, corruption among stockbrokers and in the field of finance can be profitable. Think of Bernie Madoff, who was able to manipulate and fabricate data for his personal advantage for decades. Such financial frauds are not comparable to manipulation of scientific data because financial transactions can be non-public and non-repeatable under identical conditions. As someone who's been in the scientific field for 16 years, at the lab bench and now in business and management, I am astonished at the fundamental ignorance of the scientific method even among learned intellectuals in different fields today. This does not mean that individual scientists are beyond corruption. It does mean, however, that entire fields or disciplines of scientific study are incorruptible. Let me repeat that. It does mean, I contend, that entire disciplines or fields of scientific study are incorruptible. If any scientific field is broadly corrupted, it would necessarily imply a mutual conspiracy among thousands of individuals around the world in different countries and cultures working together, and the natural rivalry between countries and governments would preclude such a long-standing conspiracy. For example, eventually Russia would want to embarrass the US, or England would want to embarrass the Germans by catching them in a fraud. No, sir, individuals may be corrupted, but not fields of study. And scientists who operate in an open system in which the public data is freely shared and published for anyone else to test on their own may be the least corruptible among us. If Mr. Molyneux should change his mind about anything, it should be that humanity is capable of averting the most serious deprivations potentially caused by climate change in the next 50 years.